First story, the Rylance Incident, Australia 2001. It was a typical Tuesday night in October 2001. I remember it vividly because it was the night that changed my life forever. I was living in Cairns, Queensland, Australia at the time, in a small house on the outskirts of town with my husband Keith. We'd gone to bed around 11 p.m. as usual. The air was thick and humid, a common occurrence in tropical North Queensland. I tossed and turned for a while, unable to get comfortable in the sticky heat. Keith was already fast asleep, his gentle snoring a familiar background noise. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I remember is jerking awake, my heart pounding in my chest. Something felt off. The room was eerily quiet, the usual chorus of night insects suspiciously absent. I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes to the darkness, when suddenly, without warning, a blinding white light flooded through our bedroom window. It was so bright, so intense, that it seemed to penetrate right through my closed eyelids. I tried to sit up, to wake Keith, but to my horror, I realized I couldn't move a muscle. My body felt heavy, like it was being pressed into the mattress by some invisible force. Panic surged through me as I struggled against this unseen restraint, but it was useless. I was completely paralyzed. The light grew even brighter, if that was possible, and I felt a strange tingling sensation spread across my skin. It started at my toes and quickly worked its way up my body, leaving a feeling of numbness in its wake. Then, in a moment that defies all logic and reason, I felt myself begin to lift off the bed. The sensation was utterly surreal. I was floating, suspended in midair, completely weightless. I wanted to scream, to call out for Keith, but my voice was gone, trapped somewhere in my frozen throat. As I hovered there, helpless and terrified, the light seemed to intensify even further, becoming almost solid. It enveloped me completely, and I had the distinct feeling of being pulled upward, as if by some powerful unseen hand. The bedroom around me began to fade, replaced by an all-encompassing whiteness. In those final moments before I lost consciousness, a single chilling thought ran through my mind. This can't be happening, this can't be real. And then, mercifully, everything went black. I have no idea how long I was out. When I finally came to, the first thing I noticed was the cold. It seeped into my bones, a stark contrast to the warm night I remembered. As my senses slowly returned, I became aware that I was lying on something hard and damp. My eyes fluttered open, and I found myself staring up at a star-filled sky. Confusion washed over me. Where was I? How did I get here? I tried to sit up, but my body felt weak, uncooperative. It took several attempts before I managed to prop myself up on my elbows. What I saw made my blood run cold. I was in the middle of a vast open field, surrounded by tall grass that swayed gently in the pre-dawn breeze. There wasn't a building or a road in sight, just endless, unfamiliar landscape stretching out in every direction. Panic began to set in as I realized I had no idea where I was or how I'd gotten there. My throat was parched, my lips cracked and dry. I felt as if I hadn't had water in days, though that couldn't be possible, could it? As the first rays of sunlight began to peek over the horizon, I noticed something else that sent a chill down my spine. My nightgown, which had been clean when I went to bed, was now covered in a strange, fine dust. It coated my skin as well, giving it an almost metallic sheen in the early morning light. Struggling to my feet, I stumbled forward, my legs weak and unsteady beneath me. The world seemed to spin, and I had to close my eyes for a moment to regain my balance. When I opened them again, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. A perfect circle of flattened grass surrounding the spot where I'd been lying. It was as if some enormous invisible weight had pressed down on the field, leaving this eerie geometric pattern in its wake. I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. As I stood there, swaying slightly in the cool morning air, fragments of something began to surface in my mind. Flashes of sterile white rooms, the hum of machinery, shadowy figures moving around me. But try as I might, I couldn't piece these fragments together into a coherent memory. They slipped away like smoke whenever I tried to focus on them, leaving me even more confused and frightened than before. I'm not sure how long I wandered through that field, calling out for help until my voice was hoarse. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on me mercilessly. My dehydration worsened, and I began to feel lightheaded and nauseous. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I heard the distant sound of a vehicle. Hope surged through me, giving me a last burst of energy. I ran towards the noise, waving my arms frantically and screaming at the top of my lungs. As I crested a small hill, I saw a dusty pickup truck bumping along a dirt road I hadn't noticed before. The driver, an older man in a battered cowboy hat, looked utterly shocked when he saw me. He slammed on the brakes, kicking up a cloud of dust as he pulled over. "Good Lord, lady," he exclaimed as he jumped out of the truck. "What in tarnation happened to you?" I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. Instead, I burst into tears, the full weight of my ordeal finally crashing down on me. The next few hours passed in a blur. The farmer, Tom was his name, gave me water and wrapped me in an old blanket he had in his truck. He radioed for help, and soon I found myself surrounded by police officers and paramedics. They peppered me with questions I couldn't answer. Where had I come from? How long had I been out here? What had happened to me? I could only shake my head, tears streaming down my face as I tried to explain that I didn't know. I kept asking for Keith, for my home, but no one seemed to know what I was talking about. It wasn't until one of the officers pulled out a map that the horrifying truth became clear. I wasn't in Cairns anymore. Somehow, impossibly, I had ended up in Gundaya, nearly 800 kilometers away from where I had gone to sleep the night before. As they loaded me into an ambulance, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in one of the vehicle's windows. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. My hair was tangled and matted, my face pale and drawn. But it was my eyes that truly frightened me. They were wide and haunted, filled with a terror I had never seen before. The hospital was a whirlwind of activity. Doctors and nurses swarmed around me, taking blood samples, running tests, and asking endless questions. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, poked and prodded from every angle. The physical examination yielded puzzling results. Despite my apparent ordeal, there were no signs of injury or trauma. No cuts, no bruises, not even a sunburn despite my hours in the open field. The only physical anomalies were my severe dehydration and a series of strange, perfectly circular marks on my arms and legs. They looked almost like injection sites, but the doctors couldn't explain their origin. As I lay there, hooked up to an IV drip, I overheard snippets of conversation between the medical staff. Words like impossible and unprecedented kept coming up. I wanted to scream at them, to tell them that I knew it was impossible, that none of this made any sense. But I remained silent, too exhausted and overwhelmed to do anything but stare at the ceiling, trying to piece together the fragments of my shattered reality. It wasn't long before the police returned, this time accompanied by a stern-looking man in a suit who introduced himself as Detective Sergeant John Mangan. He sat down beside my bed, notepad in hand, and began to ask me questions in a gentle but probing manner. I did my best to recount what I remembered: going to bed in cairns, the blinding light, the sensation of floating, and then waking up in that field. With each word, I could see the skepticism growing in his eyes. I knew how it sounded. Hell, if someone had told me this story a day ago, I would have thought they were crazy or lying. But I also knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that it had happened. As I finished my account, Sergeant Mangan leaned back in his chair, a troubled expression on his face. "Mrs. Rylance," he said slowly, "I understand this is difficult, but I need you to think carefully. Is there any chance you left your home voluntarily? Any reason you might have traveled to Gundia?" I shook my head vehemently, frustration building inside me. "No," I insisted. "I went to sleep in my bed next to my husband. I didn't choose this." The mention of Keith seemed to trigger something in the detective's mind. He flipped through his notes, then looked back at me with a mix of confusion and concern. "Your husband," he said carefully, "Keith Rylance. He reported you missing early this morning. Said he woke up around 2:30 a.m. and you were gone. The bed was empty, but there were no signs of forced entry or struggle." My mind reeled at this information. Keith had been there, had witnessed at least part of what happened to me. But why hadn't he been taken too? Why had whatever force that snatched me left him behind? Before I could voice any of these questions, Sergeant Mangan continued, his tone becoming even more serious. "Mrs. Rylance, I have to ask, is everything all right at home? Are you and your husband having any problems?" The implication behind his words hit me like a physical blow. They thought I had run away, that I had somehow traveled 800 kilometers in the middle of the night of my own free will. Anger surged through me, momentarily overwhelming my fear and confusion. "No!" I shouted, sitting up in bed despite the dizziness that washed over me. "You're not listening to me. I didn't leave, I was taken. There was a light, and I couldn't move, and then I was just gone." Tears of frustration streamed down my face as I pleaded with the detective to believe me, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't. To him, I was just another missing person case, probably a troubled woman who had decided to run away from her life. He couldn't begin to comprehend the truth, that something beyond his understanding, beyond anyone's understanding, had reached down from the sky and plucked me from my bed. The next few days were a blur of tests, questions, and disbelief. Keith arrived at the hospital, his face a mixture of relief and confusion. When we were finally left alone, I broke down in his arms, sobbing as I tried to explain what had happened. To his credit, he listened without interrupting, holding me tightly as I recounted the terrifying experience. But I could feel his skepticism, could see the doubt in his eyes even as he murmured words of comfort. It hurt more than I could have imagined, realizing that even my own husband couldn't fully believe me. The doctors found no physical explanation for my ordeal. Apart from the dehydration and those strange circular marks, which faded after a few days, I was in perfect health. Psychologists were brought in, gently probing my mental state, clearly searching for signs of a breakdown or some kind of fugue state. But I knew I wasn't crazy. The terror I had experienced was too real, too visceral to be a product of my imagination. As the days wore on, my story began to leak to the press. Reporters camped outside the hospital, clamoring for interviews and photographs. The headlines were sensational. Woman claims alien abduction in Queensland outback, and missing wife reappears 800 kilometers away, blames UFOs. It was surreal seeing my face plastered across newspapers and TV screens, my experience reduced to clickbait and late-night talk show fodder. Some people believed me, reaching out with their own stories of strange lights in the sky and missing time. But far more were skeptical, accusing me of everything from attention-seeking to infidelity. The constant scrutiny and disbelief began to wear on me. I started to doubt myself, wondering if there was some rational explanation I was missing. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that blinding light, felt that sensation of weightlessness. Whatever had happened to me, it was real. After a week, I was finally released from the hospital. Keith and I returned to Cairns, hoping to put the whole ordeal behind us and return to some semblance of normalcy. But nothing felt normal anymore. Our cozy home, once a place of comfort and safety, now felt exposed and vulnerable. I couldn't sleep in our bedroom, the memories of that night too fresh and terrifying. Instead, I spent my nights on the couch, jumping at every sound, peering nervously out the windows at the star-filled sky. During the day, I threw myself into research, scouring the internet for similar cases, reaching out to UFO researchers and support groups for abductees. I found some comfort in these communities, in knowing I wasn't alone in my experience. But with each story I read, each account of lost time and inexplicable journeys, my fear only grew. What if it happened again? What if next time I didn't come back? As weeks turned into months, the media frenzy died down, but the impact on my life remained. Keith tried his best to be supportive, but I could sense his growing frustration with my obsession. Our relationship became strained, conversations often devolving into arguments about what really happened that night. I couldn't blame him for his doubts. I knew how insane it all sounded. But his inability to fully believe me created a rift between us that seemed to widen with each passing day. I started experiencing nightmares, vivid and terrifying. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the echo of strange, high-pitched sounds ringing in my ears. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of tall, shadowy figures at the edge of my vision, only to find nothing there when I turned to look. Was I going crazy? Or were these fragments of suppressed memories slowly bubbling to the surface? About 6 months after my experience, I received an unexpected call. It was from a man named Dr. James Turner, a ufologist who had been investigating my case. He explained that he had been analyzing satellite imagery from the night of my alleged abduction and had made a startling discovery. There was a brief but significant electromagnetic disturbance recorded over Cairns at exactly 2:30 a.m., the time Keith reported waking up to find me missing. Moreover, a similar disturbance was detected near Gundyre just before dawn, around the time I was found. Dr. Turner's voice was filled with excitement as he explained the implications of his findings, but I felt a cold dread settling in the pit of my stomach. This was proof, tangible evidence that something extraordinary had occurred that night. Part of me had been clinging to the hope that there was some rational explanation for what had happened to me. Now, that hope was slipping away, replaced by the terrifying realization that my worst fears might be true. The revelation of Dr. Turner's findings reignited media interest in my case. Once again, I found myself in the spotlight, recounting my experience to skeptical journalists and wide-eyed believers alike. Some hailed me as a brave whistleblower, exposing the reality of extraterrestrial visitation. Others dismissed the electromagnetic data as coincidence or hoax, doubling down on their skepticism. The renewed attention brought a fresh wave of scrutiny and judgment, reopening wounds that had only just begun to heal. Keith and I fought more frequently, his patience wearing thin with what he saw as my inability to move on. I couldn't blame him. How could I expect him to understand something I barely comprehended myself? But the growing distance between us was painful, a constant reminder of how much that night had cost me. I began to withdraw from friends and family, finding it easier to isolate myself than to face their doubt or pity. My world had narrowed to a singular focus, understanding what had happened to me and why. Today, years after that fateful night, I still don't have all the answers. The circular marks on my skin have long since faded, leaving no physical evidence of my ordeal. The electromagnetic data, while intriguing, is far from conclusive proof of an alien abduction. And yet, the experience remains as vivid and terrifying in my mind as it was the moment I woke up in that field. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, the constant questions that may never be fully answered. Keith and I eventually separated, the strain of my experience proving too much for our marriage to bear. I found some peace in connecting with others who have had similar experiences, in knowing that I'm not alone in grappling with the unknown. But there's not a day that goes by that I don't look up at the sky and wonder, will they come back? Why was I chosen? What really happened during those lost hours? The not knowing is perhaps the most terrifying part of all, because deep down, in a place I rarely let myself acknowledge, I fear that one day I'll find out. That one night I'll wake up to that blinding light again, paralyzed and helpless, and this time, I might not come back. Second story, The Mountain Road Encounter, Norway, 1997. It was a frigid night in February 1997, and I was making my way through the winding mountain roads of Norway. The darkness was all-consuming, broken only by the weak beams of my headlights. I'd made this drive countless times before, but something felt different that night. The air was heavy with an unsettling stillness, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. I remember glancing at the clock on my dashboard, 11:23 p.m. Little did I know that those glowing numbers would be seared into my memory forever, a constant reminder of the moment my life changed irrevocably. As I navigated a particularly treacherous curve, the first snowflakes began to fall. Within minutes, it had escalated into a full-blown blizzard. The road vanished beneath a thick blanket of white, and my windshield wipers struggled futilely against the onslaught. I could barely see 5 feet in front of me. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I should pull over, but there was nowhere safe to stop on these narrow mountain roads. I was trapped, inching forward at a snail's pace, praying I wouldn't veer off the edge of a cliff. That's when it happened. A blinding blue light erupted, above me so bright it turned night into day. At first I thought it must be lightning, but there was no thunder, no flashing, This light was constant, pulsing, almost alive. It bathed everything in an eerie azure glow, reflecting off the snowflakes and creating a surreal, shimmering curtain around my car. I felt a vibration deep in my bones, a low hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My skin tingled, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was happening was not of this world. Panic gripped me as I realized my car was slowing down, despite my foot pressing harder on the accelerator. The engine sputtered and died, plunging me into silence save for the persistent hum. My headlights flickered and went out, leaving me in total darkness for a split second before that otherworldly blue light flooded back in. I fumbled for the radio, desperate for any connection to the outside world, but it only emitted a harsh, grating static that seemed to stab directly into my brain. I tried to open the door, to run, to hide, anything to escape whatever was happening. But my body wouldn't respond. It was as if I'd been turned to stone, frozen in place by some unseen force. The blue light intensified, becoming almost painful to look at. I squeezed my eyes shut, but it penetrated my eyelids, burning itself into my retinas. The humming grew louder, vibrating through every cell in my body. I felt a sensation of weightlessness, of being pulled upward. My stomach lurched, as if I was on a roller coaster that had just crested its highest peak. And then, nothing. No car, no mountain road, no snowstorm. I found myself lying on my back, staring up at a curved metallic ceiling that seemed to glow with its own inner light. The surface beneath me was smooth and cold, almost frictionless. I tried to move, to sit up, but my limbs felt impossibly heavy. That's when I saw them. Figures, moving around me with an eerie grace. They were tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long and thin to be real. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, with a faint bluish tint that pulsed in rhythm. With that persistent humming, I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but no sound came out when I opened my mouth. The beings, I couldn't bring myself to call them aliens, even though I knew that's what they must be, didn't speak. Not with words, at least. But I could feel their presence in my mind, probing, questioning, analyzing. It was as if they were rifling through my thoughts and memories like pages in a book. I felt stripped bare, more vulnerable than I'd ever been in my life. One of them approached me, looming over my paralyzed form. Its face was a featureless oval, smooth and blank, save for two enormous almond-shaped eyes that seemed to swallow all light. Those eyes, I'll never forget them as long as I live. They were completely black, depthless pools that seemed to contain entire universes. As I stared into them, I felt myself falling, spiraling into an abyss of knowledge and terror that no human mind was meant to comprehend. The being raised a hand, if you could call it that. It was more like a tendril, long and sinuous with too many joints. As it hovered over my body, I felt a tingling sensation, as if every nerve ending was being stimulated at once. They were studying me, I realized, examining every inch of my body, inside and out. I could feel them cataloging every cell, every atom of my being. The invasion was total, physical and mental. I wanted to fight, to resist, but I was utterly powerless. All I could do was endure as they systematically took me apart and put me back together again. Time lost all meaning in that strange, sterile environment. It could have been minutes, hours or days that I lay there, subjected to their relentless examination. The beings moved around me in perfect synchronicity, their movements fluid and purposeful. Occasionally, one would produce an instrument. At least that's what I assumed they were. These devices defied description, seeming to shift and change shape even as I looked at them. They emitted soft pulses of light in colors I'd never seen before, colors that shouldn't exist. Throughout it all, the mental probing continued. I felt them sifting through my memories, lingering on certain moments of my life. They seemed particularly interested in my childhood, in moments of strong emotion or significant decision-making. It was as if they were trying to understand what made me human, what drove my choices and shaped my identity. But their curiosity felt clinical, detached. There was no malice in their actions, but no compassion either. I was simply a specimen, to be studied, no different from an insect pinned to a board. As the examination progressed, I became aware of a growing pressure in my head. It started as a dull ache behind my eyes, but quickly intensified into a searing pain that threatened to split my skull open. Images began to flash through my mind, bizarre landscapes, incomprehensible structures, and creatures that defied the laws of biology as I understood them. I realized with a jolt of terror that these weren't my memories. They were showing me something, imparting knowledge that my brain struggled to process. The pain became unbearable, and just when I thought I couldn't take any more, everything went black. I came to with a start, gasping for air as if I'd been underwater. It took me several disorienting moments to realize I was back in my car. The snowstorm had vanished, leaving behind a clear, star-filled sky. My headlights were on, cutting through the darkness, and the engine was idling softly. It was as if nothing had happened. But something felt off. The air smelled different, charged with an electric tang that made my skin prickle. And when I looked at the clock on my dashboard, my blood ran cold. It read 2:37 a.m. 3 hours and 14 minutes had passed since I'd first noticed the snowstorm. With trembling hands, I put the car in gear and started driving. I needed to get home, to familiar surroundings where I could try to make sense of what had just happened. But as I drove, I became increasingly aware that something was wrong with me. My vision seemed sharper, colors more vibrant. I could hear the individual components of my engine working in perfect harmony, a symphony of mechanical precision I'd never noticed before. When I absent-mindedly scratched an itch on my arm, I was shocked to see faint bluish lines tracing patterns under my skin, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. As I pulled into my driveway, a wave of nausea hit me. I barely made it out of the car before I was on my hands and knees, violently ill. But what came out of me wasn't normal. It was a viscous, silvery substance that seemed to move of its own accord, pooling on the ground before evaporating into a fine mist. I staggered into my house, locking the door behind me as if that could keep out the horrors I'd experienced. I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror and froze. My eyes, for just a moment, I swear they were completely black, like those of the beings that had examined me. Sleep was out of the question that night. I paced my living room, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been some sort of hallucination brought on by stress and the treacherous driving conditions? But I couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness, the sense that I had been fundamentally changed by my experience. I found myself scribbling frantically in a notebook, filling page after page with strange symbols and diagrams I didn't understand. My hand moved of its own accord, channeling knowledge that felt alien and familiar at the same time. As dawn broke, I finally collapsed from exhaustion. My dreams were vivid and terrifying, filled with those black eyes and the sensation of falling through endless space. I woke up drenched in sweat, my sheets tangled around me like a straitjacket. The morning light streaming through my window should have been comforting, but it felt harsh and invasive. I stumbled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, in an attempt to clear my head. That's when I noticed them. Small, circular marks on my arms and torso. They weren't bruises or cuts, but perfect circles of skin that seemed slightly discolored, as if I'd been branded. The following days were a blur of paranoia and confusion. I called in sick to work, unable to face the thought of interacting with others. I became obsessed with researching UFO sightings and alien abduction stories, looking for anything that might validate my experience. But nothing I found quite matched what had happened to me. The more I read, the more I began to doubt my own sanity. Had I simply had some sort of mental breakdown? Was my mind trying to protect itself by fabricating this bizarre narrative? As the days turned into weeks, I struggled to maintain any semblance of normalcy. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford, plagued as I was by nightmares of cold, metal tables and probing alien minds. When I did manage to drift off, I'd often wake up in strange places, huddled in a corner of my basement or out in my backyard, staring up at the stars with no memory of how I got there. The incidents always left me with a lingering sense of dread, as if some part of me knew I'd been somewhere else during those lost hours. I tried to go back to work, to reconnect with friends and family, but everything felt different. Conversations that once flowed easily now seemed stilted and superficial. How could I possibly relate to their mundane concerns when I carried the weight of this cosmic secret? I found myself withdrawing, spending more and more time alone with my thoughts, and the ever-growing collection of notebooks filled with my incomprehensible scribblings. The physical changes persisted as well. My senses remained hyper-aware, sometimes overwhelmingly so. I could hear my neighbors' whispered conversations through walls, smell emotions on people's skin. Food tasted different. Some flavors became unbearably intense, while others seemed to lose all taste entirely. And then there were the headaches. They would come on suddenly, bringing with them flashes of those alien landscapes I'd glimpsed during my abduction. Each time I felt like I was on the verge of understanding something vast and terrifying, only to have it slip away as the pain subsided. About a month after the incident, I decided I couldn't bear the isolation any longer. I needed answers, or at least someone to talk to who might understand. I found an online forum dedicated to alien abduction experiences, and after lurking for days, finally worked up the courage to share my story. The responses were a mixed bag. Some were supportive, claiming similar experiences. Others were skeptical, suggesting I seek psychiatric help. But one message stood out. It was from someone claiming to be a researcher studying these phenomena, and they wanted to meet. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet this person, Dr. Elena Costas, she called herself, at a small cafe in a nearby town. As I sat there, waiting, nursing a coffee that tasted like ash in my mouth, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not just by the other patrons, whose conversations I could hear with unsettling clarity, but by something else. Something vast and patient, observing from afar. Dr. Costas arrived precisely on time. She was a small, unassuming woman with graying hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. But as soon as she sat down across from me, I felt a jolt of recognition. There was something in her gaze, a depth of understanding that told me she knew. She'd been through this too. For the next several hours, we talked. She listened without judgment as I poured out my story, nodding occasionally and asking probing questions that made me realize just how much I'd been holding back, even from myself. As our conversation deepened, Dr. Costas began to share her own theories about what was happening to people like us. She believed that the aliens, though she was careful to say we couldn't be sure they were truly extraterrestrial, were conducting some sort of long-term study on humanity. The abductions, she suggested, were more than just physical examinations. They were attempts to understand our consciousness, perhaps even to alter it in some fundamental way. Think about it, she said, leaning in close. The changes you've experienced, the enhanced senses, the strange knowledge that seems to bubble up from nowhere, these aren't random side effects. They're deliberate modifications. But to what end? Her eyes gleamed with a mixture of fear and excitement that made my skin crawl. I wanted to dismiss her ideas as the ravings of a conspiracy theorist, but I couldn't. Everything she said resonated with a truth I felt deep in my bones. As we talked, more memories of my abduction began to surface. I remembered the beings communicating with each other, not through words or even thoughts, but through a complex exchange of emotions and abstract concepts. I recalled the sensation of my mind being expanded, stretched to encompass ideas too vast for human comprehension. Dr. Costas listened intently as I described these newly surfaced memories. Her face grew more serious with each detail I shared. This is consistent with what other abductees have reported, she said, her voice low and urgent. But you've given us some new pieces of the puzzle. The way you described their communication, it's like they're operating on a completely different plane of existence. She pulled out a small notebook and began sketching rapidly. To my astonishment, the symbols she drew were eerily similar to the ones I'd been scribbling in my own fevered states. "Have you seen these before?" she asked, sliding the notebook towards me. I nodded, a chill running down my spine. "These keep showing up in abductee reports," she explained. "We think they might be some kind of language or code, but we haven't been able to decipher it." As I stared at the symbols, something strange happened. They seemed to shift and dance on the page, rearranging themselves into patterns that almost made sense. I felt a pressure building behind my eyes, similar to what I'd experienced during the abduction. Without thinking, I grabbed a pen and began adding to Dr. Costas's sketches, my hand moving of its own accord. When I finally snapped out of it, I looked down to see I'd filled several pages with intricate diagrams and more of those alien symbols. Dr. Costas was ecstatic, practically vibrating with excitement as she pored over what I'd drawn. "This is incredible," she breathed. "It's like your mind has been rewired to understand their language on some subconscious level." But as she spoke, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The cafe seemed to spin around me, the chatter of other patrons turning into a deafening roar. I stumbled to my feet, knocking over my chair in the process. "I need some air," I gasped, pushing past Dr. Costas and out onto the street. The world outside was too bright, too loud, too everything. Cars honked, people shouted, and every sensation felt like an assault on my overloaded senses. I staggered down the sidewalk, trying to get away from it all, but there was nowhere to go. The buildings seemed to loom over me, their shadows reaching out like grasping fingers. Suddenly I felt it again, that humming vibration deep in my bones. I looked up to see a flash of blue light reflecting off the windows of a nearby skyscraper. My heart began to race. They were here. They had found me. I wanted to run, to hide, but my body wouldn't respond. I stood there, frozen in place as the light grew brighter and the humming intensified. Time seemed to slow down. I watched in horrified fascination as people around me continued about their day, oblivious to the otherworldly phenomenon unfolding in their midst. Was I the only one who could see it? Or was this all happening in my mind? The line between reality and hallucination had become so blurred that I no longer trusted my own perceptions. The blue light engulfed me, and I felt that familiar sensation of weightlessness. The street, the buildings, the people, everything faded away, replaced by that sterile, metallic environment I remembered from my first abduction. But this time was different. Instead of being paralyzed on an examination table, I found myself standing upright, facing one of the tall alien beings. Its black eyes bore into mine, and I braced myself for the mental invasion I'd experienced before. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt a sense of recognition, not just from the being, but from within myself. It was as if some dormant part of my mind had awakened, allowing me to perceive this creature in a way I couldn't before. I saw complexity, depth, even emotion behind those obsidian orbs, and I realized with a start that it was just as curious about me as I was about it. The being raised one of its long, multi-jointed appendages and made a series of fluid gestures. To my amazement, I understood. It wasn't exactly language, more like a stream of concepts and emotions conveyed through movement. They were apologizing, explaining. I got flashes of a vast interstellar mission, a search for understanding that spanned millennia. Humanity, it seemed, was just one of many species they were studying, trying to comprehend the nature of consciousness across the universe. As this knowledge flooded into me, I felt my perspective shift dramatically. The terror that had gripped me for weeks began to subside, replaced by a sense of awe at the sheer scale of what I was witnessing. The being continued its communication, showing me glimpses of worlds beyond imagination, civilizations that defied human comprehension. I saw the birth and death of stars, the collision of galaxies, the very fabric of reality bending and twisting in ways that made my head spin. But with this expanding awareness came a deep, gnawing emptiness. I realized that I could never go back to my old life, never see the world the same way again. The mundane concerns that once occupied my thoughts now seemed laughably insignificant in the face of this cosmic tapestry. Tears streamed down my face as I grappled with the immensity of it all, mourning the loss of my blissful ignorance, even as I marveled at the wonders being revealed to me. The being sensed my turmoil. It extended its appendage again, this time gently touching my forehead. A warmth spread through my body, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me. More images flowed into my mind, but these were different. I saw myself, but not as I was now. I saw potential futures, branching paths of what I could become. In some, I used my new knowledge to push the boundaries of human science and understanding. In others, I became a bridge between our species, helping to prepare humanity for a broader cosmic awareness. As these visions faded, I found myself back on the street, the hustle and bustle of the city continuing around me as if nothing had happened, but everything had changed. I stood there for a long moment, my mind reeling as I tried to process what I'd just experienced. The blue light was gone, the humming had ceased, but I could still feel the after effects coursing through me. My senses, already heightened since the first abduction, now felt even more acute. I could practically taste the electromagnetic waves in the air, see the invisible currents of energy flowing around me. I made my way back to the cafe on shaky legs, half expecting Dr. Costas to be gone. But there she was, still poring over, the notebook filled with my strange drawings. She looked up as I approached, her eyes widening at whatever she saw in my face. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I opened my mouth to respond, but how could I possibly put into words what I'd just been through? How could I explain that in the span of what felt like both an eternity and a mere moment, my entire understanding of the universe had been irreversibly altered? "Everything," I finally managed to say, collapsing into the chair across from her. "Everything happened." And then, haltingly at first but with growing confidence, I began to tell her about my experience. As I spoke, I could see the mix of emotions playing across her face: excitement, disbelief, and maybe a touch of envy. She peppered me with questions, scribbling furiously in her notebook as I described the being's method of communication, the visions they'd shown me, the sense of cosmic purpose I now felt. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Costas breathed when I finally finished speaking. "No one has ever reported this level of direct communication before. It's almost as if they've—" She trailed off, her brow furrowing in concentration. "As if they've activated something in you, changed you somehow to be more compatible with their way of thinking." Her words sent a chill down my spine because I knew she was right. I wasn't the same person I'd been before that snowy night on the mountain road. The changes went beyond just enhanced senses or strange knowledge. My very way of perceiving the world, of processing information, had been fundamentally altered. And as terrifying as that realization was, there was also an undeniable excitement building within me. I had been given a gift, a chance to see and understand things no other human could. As Dr. Costas and I continued to talk late into the night, making plans for further research and exploration of my new abilities, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The beings had shown me potential futures, yes, but the path to those futures was far from clear. I knew there would be challenges ahead: skepticism from the scientific community, potential danger from those who might see me as a threat, the struggle to maintain my humanity in the face of this cosmic awareness. But there was also hope. Hope that my experience could somehow bridge the gap between our world and theirs, that it could help prepare humanity for the vast, strange universe that awaited us beyond the confines of our little blue planet. As I left the cafe that night, stepping out into a world that looked the same but felt utterly different, I made a silent promise to myself. I would use this gift, this burden, to its fullest potential. I would seek out others like me, work with researchers like Dr. Costas, and do everything in my power to unravel the mysteries that had been laid at my feet. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with equal parts wonder and terror. But as I looked up at the star-filled sky, I felt a sense of connection to something greater than myself. Whatever happened next, I knew I was part of something truly extraordinary. The snowstorm abduction had been just the first step on a journey that would take me to the very edges of human experience and beyond. And despite the fear, despite the lingering trauma, I found myself looking forward to whatever came next with a mixture of trepidation and exhilaration. The universe, in all its vast, incomprehensible glory, was waiting. And somehow, against all odds, I had been chosen to explore it. Third story. The Icefield Encounter, Alaska, 1989. It was supposed to be just another day on the Alaskan icefield. As a seasoned cartographer, I'd spent countless hours mapping these remote, frozen landscapes, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that fateful day in 1989. The morning started like any other. Crisp air biting at my exposed skin, the crunch of snow beneath my boots, and the vast expanse of white stretching out in every direction. I'd been out there for weeks, meticulously documenting the terrain, my trusty compass and GPS guiding me through the treacherous ice. Little did I know that in just a few hours, my entire world would be turned upside down, leaving me with questions that haunt me to this day. As I trudged through the snow, double-checking my coordinates and making notes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first, just a nagging sensation in the pit of my stomach. Maybe it was the way the light seemed to bend oddly around the ice formations, or how the usual ambient sounds of the wilderness seemed muffled. I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to fatigue from the long expedition. But as the day wore on, that feeling of unease only grew stronger, like a primal instinct warning me of impending danger. It was mid-afternoon when things started to go seriously wrong. I was making my way across a particularly flat stretch of ice when my compass began to act up. At first I thought it was just a minor malfunction. These things happen in extreme conditions. But as I watched, the needle started spinning wildly, as if caught in some invisible magnetic storm. Frowning, I pulled out my GPS unit, hoping it would give me a reliable reading. To my growing dismay, the screen was nothing but static, occasionally flickering with strange symbols I'd never seen before. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperatures. In all my years of fieldwork, I'd never experienced anything like this. That's when I noticed the silence. It hit me like a physical force. The complete and utter absence of sound. No wind whistling across the ice, no distant crack of shifting glaciers, not even the sound of my own breathing. It was as if the world had been wrapped in a blanket of absolute quiet. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt my heart rate quicken. Something was very, very wrong. I spun around, scanning the horizon, desperate for some sign of normalcy. And that's when I saw it. Hovering just above the ice, maybe 100 yards away, was an object that defied explanation. Dark and oval-shaped, it seemed to absorb the light around it, creating a visual distortion that hurt my eyes to look at directly. It made no sound, no visible means of propulsion, yet it was clearly there, unmistakably real and utterly alien. I stood there, frozen in place, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. The craft, because what else could I call it, remained motionless, as if studying me just as intently as I was staring at it. That's when I felt it, a deep, bone-rattling vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a sound I could hear, but a sensation that permeated every cell in my body. My teeth chattered, and I felt a pressure building in my head like it was about to explode. I wanted to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there, exposed on that endless field of ice. But my body wouldn't respond. It was as if the vibration had short-circuited the connection between my brain and my muscles. I tried to call out, but no sound came from my throat. The pressure in my head intensified, and my vision began to blur. The last thing I remember is the dark shape of the craft seeming to grow larger, filling my entire field of view. And then, nothing. Blackness swallowed me whole, and I felt myself falling into an abyss of lost time and forgotten experiences. When I came to, the world slowly swam back into focus. I was lying face down on the ice, the cold seeping through my protective gear. Disoriented and groggy, I pushed myself up, my limbs feeling oddly disconnected from my body. As my vision cleared, I saw my equipment scattered around me in a wide circle, as if a localized whirlwind had torn through the area. But the air was still, and that unnatural silence had lifted, replaced by the familiar ambient sounds of the ice field. Panic set in as I scrambled to gather my belongings, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I fumbled for my watch, desperate to get my bearings. When I finally managed to focus on the display, my blood ran cold. Nearly 4 hours had passed since my last clear memory. 4 hours of my life just gone. I spun around, searching for any sign of the craft, any evidence of what had transpired during that lost time. But there was nothing, just the endless expanse of ice and snow, looking exactly as it had before. Or did it? Something about the landscape seemed subtly altered, as if the very geography had shifted ever so slightly. I couldn't put my finger on what exactly had changed, but an overwhelming sense of wrongness permeated everything around me. As I continued to gather my scattered gear, I noticed something else that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. My arms were burning, the skin red and irritated as if I'd been sunburned. But this was no ordinary sunburn. The pattern was strange, almost geometric, like I'd been exposed to some kind of intense, focused heat source. I rolled up my sleeves, revealing more of the bizarre markings. They didn't hurt exactly, but they tingled and throbbed in a way that felt decidedly unnatural. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I hallucinated the whole thing? Was I suffering from some kind of extreme hypothermia or altitude sickness? But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The missing time, the scattered equipment, the inexplicable burns. Something had happened out there on the ice, something beyond my comprehension. I tried to piece together a rational explanation, but every attempt fell apart in the face of the impossible reality I'd experienced. As I finished repacking my gear, I noticed that my compass and GPS were now functioning normally, as if nothing had ever been amiss. This only added to my growing sense of unease. What kind of force could have caused such a localized disruption of electronics and then vanished without a trace? I found myself jumping at every sound, every play of light on the ice, half expecting to see that dark, oval shape materialize again. The rational part of my brain kept insisting that there had to be a logical explanation, but the primal fear that had taken root in my gut told a different story. I knew I should continue my work, complete the mapping expedition as planned, but the thought of spending another night out on the ice field filled me with a dread I couldn't shake. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to get off this godforsaken ice, to return to civilization and the comforting embrace of the familiar. And yet, a part of me, a part I wasn't entirely comfortable acknowledging, felt an inexplicable pull to stay, to investigate further, to uncover the truth behind what had happened during those missing hours. It was as if the experience had left a hook in my mind, tugging me towards some unknown revelation. I stood there, torn between fear and fascination, the vast Alaskan wilderness suddenly feeling alien and hostile. The sun was starting to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the ice. I knew I had to make a decision soon. Night out here could be deadly under normal circumstances, let alone whatever this was. As I debated my next move, I became aware of a faint, high-pitched ringing in my ears. At first, I thought it was just the aftermath of the strange vibration I'd felt earlier. But as I focused on it, the sound seemed to carry a pattern, almost like a code or a message. Just beyond the reach of my understanding, the ringing in my ears persisted as I made the decision to break camp and head back to base. Every step I took felt like I was moving through molasses, my body heavy and uncooperative. The familiar landscape now seemed sinister, shadows stretching and morphing in ways that defied logic. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, observed by unseen eyes that tracked my every move. As I trudged through the snow, my mind kept replaying the events of the day, trying to find some thread of sanity in the madness I'd experienced. But the more I thought about it, the more questions arose. Why me? Why here, in this remote corner of Alaska? And most importantly, what had happened during those missing hours? The burns on my arms tingled, a constant reminder that this wasn't just some vivid hallucination. I found myself obsessively checking and rechecking them, half expecting the marks to fade away or transform into something even more bizarre. But they remained, angry red patterns etched into my skin like some alien tattoo. As night fell, the aurora borealis began to dance across the sky. Normally, I would have been in awe of the spectacle, but tonight, the swirling lights only added to my sense of disorientation. The colors seemed more vivid, more alive than I'd ever seen them before. Greens and purples pulsed and throbbed, and for a terrifying moment I could have sworn I saw shapes moving within the lights. Dark, oval silhouettes that mirrored the craft I'd seen earlier. I blinked hard, and the shapes disappeared, leaving me to wonder if my mind was finally starting to crack under the strain. The journey back to base seemed to take an eternity. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow held the potential for some new, unimaginable horror. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that silent, hovering craft following me. The rational part of my brain tried to reassure me that I was safe now, that whatever had happened was over. But a deeper, more primal part knew better. Something fundamental had changed. In me, in my perception of reality, in everything. When I finally stumbled into the base camp, my colleagues were shocked by my appearance. They later told me I looked like I'd aged years in the span of a day, my eyes wild and haunted. I must have been quite a sight. Clothes disheveled, gear haphazardly packed, and those strange burns visible on my arms. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out in a jumbled mess. How could I possibly articulate something that I myself couldn't understand? The burn patterns drew concerned looks and prompted immediate medical attention. The base doctor examined them, baffled by their origin and geometric precision. He took samples, ran tests, but ultimately could provide no explanation for their appearance. To make matters even more confusing, the burns began to fade rapidly over the next few days, leaving no trace on my skin. It was as if my body was erasing the physical evidence of my encounter, leaving me to question whether it had really happened at all. In the days that followed, I struggled to regain a sense of normalcy. Sleep eluded me, and when I did manage to drift off, my dreams were filled with fragmented images that left me drenched in cold sweat. Flashes of metallic corridors, strange symbols that seemed to shift and change as I looked at them, and the sensation of being observed by entities just beyond my peripheral vision. I'd wake up gasping for air, the taste of ozone lingering in my mouth. My colleagues tried to be supportive, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They suggested everything from altitude sickness to stress-induced hallucinations to explain away my experience. Part of me wanted to believe them, to accept a rational explanation and move on with my life. But the memory of that craft, the bone-deep vibration and those missing hours haunted me. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. No mundane explanation could account for it. As the expedition drew to a close, I found myself becoming obsessed with trying to understand what had happened to me. I pored over maps of the area, looking for any anomalies or patterns that might explain the incident. I reached out to other researchers who had worked in the region, discreetly asking if they had ever experienced anything unusual. Most dismissed my inquiries, but a few hesitated before answering, their eyes darting away as if hiding some secret they dared not speak aloud. It was in one of these conversations that I first heard whispered rumors of other incidents in Alaska. Strange lights in the sky, unexplained equipment malfunctions, and even missing time experiences similar to my own. These stories were always shared in hushed tones, with nervous glances over shoulders, as if speaking them aloud might somehow summon whatever forces were at work in the frozen wilderness. Returning to civilization should have been a relief, but instead, I found myself feeling increasingly alienated from the world around me. Everyday life seemed trivial, almost laughably insignificant compared to the mysteries I had glimpsed on that ice field. I threw myself into research, spending countless hours in libraries and later, scouring the early internet for any information that might shed light on my experience. UFO sightings, government cover-ups, ancient alien theories. I devoured it all, searching for some thread that would connect to my own encounter. But the more I learned, the more questions arose. Were there others out there like me, carrying the weight of experiences they could neither fully remember nor explain? And if so, what did it all mean? The burns on my arms had long since faded, leaving no physical trace of my ordeal. Sometimes in the dark of night, I would trace my fingers over the skin where they had been, half expecting to feel some residual heat or texture, but there was nothing. Just smooth, unmarked flesh that gave no hint of the extraordinary event that had changed my life forever. As the years passed, my obsession with understanding what happened that day in Alaska never truly faded. It became a constant undercurrent in my life, influencing my choices and relationships in ways I couldn't always predict or control. I found myself drawn to remote locations, always half hoping, half dreading that I might experience something similar again. But nothing ever came close to that day on the ice field. There were moments, though, fleeting instants when the world seemed to shift slightly out of focus, when I'd catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye that disappeared when I tried to look directly at it. These occurrences were rare, but each one sent a jolt of recognition through me, a reminder that whatever I had encountered was still out there, perhaps watching, waiting. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, always on alert for any sign of the unusual or unexplained. This heightened state of awareness was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it made me an exceptional observer, noticing details that others might miss. But it also left me constantly on edge, unable to fully relax or immerse myself in the simple pleasures of life. The impact on my personal life was profound. Relationships suffered as I struggled to connect with people who couldn't understand the weight of what I carried. How could I explain to a potential partner that I was forever changed by an encounter I couldn't fully remember or articulate? Many nights I'd find myself standing outside, staring up at the stars, wondering if somewhere up there, the beings responsible for my experience were looking back. Were they studying us? Experimenting? Or was there some greater purpose to their actions that my limited human understanding couldn't grasp? These questions consumed me, driving me to seek out others who had similar experiences. I attended conferences, joined online forums, and even participated in sky watches, all in the hope of finding some answers. What I discovered was a community of individuals, all marked by experiences that defied conventional explanation. Some had stories remarkably similar to mine, missing time, strange burns or marks, and a sense of having been examined or studied. Others had wildly different encounters, but all shared that same sense of having touched something beyond the realm of ordinary human experience. One of the most frustrating aspects of my post-encounter life was the inconsistency of my memories. There were times when I felt I could almost grasp what had happened during those missing hours, tantalizing fragments of memory that would surface in dreams or during moments of deep concentration. I'd see flashes of a sterile, white environment, feel the touch of something not quite human, or hear snippets of a language that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to my mind. But these memories, if that's what they were, remained maddeningly elusive. As soon as I tried to focus on them, to pin them down and examine them closely, they would slip away like smoke, leaving me with nothing but a vague sense of unease and the certainty that I was missing something crucial. This led me to explore various methods of memory recovery, hypnosis, meditation, even some more experimental techniques, but each attempt left me more frustrated than the last. It was as if there was a block in my mind, a barrier erected either by my own psyche as a defense mechanism or, more disturbingly, by whatever entities had been responsible for my experience. As I sit here now, decades removed from that day on the Alaskan ice field, I find myself no closer to understanding the true nature of what happened to me. The experience has shaped every aspect of my life, leaving me with a perspective that sets me apart from those who haven't glimpsed behind the veil of our everyday reality. There are times when I envy those who can go through life without the burden of knowing that there are things out there beyond our comprehension, forces that can pluck a person from their normal existence and leave them forever changed. But then, I remember the awe I felt in that moment when I first saw the craft, the sense of standing on the precipice of a vast, unknown universe. And I know that despite the challenges and the unanswered questions, I wouldn't trade that knowledge for anything. The burns on my arms may have faded long ago, but the impact of that day remains etched into my very being. I still find myself scanning the skies, especially on clear nights when the stars seem close enough to touch. Part of me hopes for another encounter, a chance to finally understand what happened during those missing hours. Another part dreads the possibility, knowing that such an event could shatter what remains of my tenuous grip on a normal life. But mostly, I've come to accept that I may never have all the answers. The universe, it seems, is far stranger and more complex than we can imagine. My experience on that remote ice field was just a tiny glimpse into that vastness, a momentary lifting of the veil that separates our mundane world from the extraordinary unknown that lies just beyond our perception. And while that glimpse has left me with a lifetime of questions, it has also given me a profound appreciation for the mysteries that surround us. Every day, I wake up knowing that there is more to our reality than what meets the eye, and that knowledge, as burdensome as it can be, is also incredibly liberating. For in a world where such inexplicable events can occur, anything is possible. And so I continue to watch, to wonder, and to hope that someday, somehow, I'll find the answers I've been seeking for so long.